Good evening, everyone. As we enter into our celebration of Israel's 75th birthday, for those of you who are here at Sinai Temple, for those of you who are watching virtually, and this will be distributed widely also after, we are really thrilled and honored to welcome Dr. Ken Stein from the Center of Israel Education at Emory University to here at Sinai Temple. As Dr. Stein said, keep it short, so we'll keep it short, meaning his bio, because it's very long. BA Franklin and Marshall College, MA Michigan in History, MA in Michigan Near Eastern Literature and Language, PhD Michigan, taught at Emory from 1977 to 2022. Really, the connection to Sinai Temple, Dr. Stein is the founding president and chief content officer for the Atlanta-based Center for Israel Education, with 1.9 million visitors to its website in 2021. Using source content and original documents, CIE educates broadly across the world in multiple languages through digital, written, and presentation platforms. We're blessed to be a beneficiary of the Center for Israel Education, specifically with Sinai Akiba Academy. In fact, our 8th graders are in the land of Israel right now. They are there for Yom HaZikaron and for Yom HaAtzmaut, celebrating the 75th birthday of that amazing land. And just over the past year, Dr. Ken Stein has been influential in helping with writing the curriculum and ideas and development for our own Sinai Temple Israel Center Rabbinical School Fellowship. We don't have an acronym for that yet, but he is an expert in bringing Israel education to just so many different avenues and communities, and one of those is specifically rabbis. And many rabbis have learned from Dr. Stein not only how to speak about Israel, but how to learn about Israel before tweeting and putting out Facebook and Instagram posts. So without further ado, we want to give our attention and truly kavod and honor to Dr. Ken Stein.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherman.
Is that on?
Is this, can you guys all hear me? Right? Okay. Wow, how to compact a lifetime of learning about Israel and teaching into 45 minutes or less. In any case, we'll have some fun. We'll learn a little bit, I hope. The preface for this evening presentation is the research that I've spent about 40 years playing with, and that is understanding how Israel came into being, how it evolved in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the diplomacy engaged in it. From that, I extracted documents, sources, materials, which I used for teaching at Emory University. So my knowledge base and my teaching base originates from using primary sources. I find students are interested in it because they can engage in critical analysis. And that is always helpful, particularly in this world where polemics and politics play such a terribly influential role in the learning process. So for me, I'm able to share with you tonight some of my thoughts about Israel at 75. To begin with, and I'd like to have the folks who are listening or watching at home also to play along, if you would. I'd like everyone here to tell me in one short phrase. I'm not interested in a long presentation on your part. In just one short phrase, where do you think Zionism has succeeded? Where do you think it succeeded? I'll go back to ask you to provide me your answer in about 3 to 5 minutes, but I'll give you a chance to think about it. In doing so, I'd like you to think about where Jews were 200 years ago. More specifically, I'd like to ask the question, where was the United States in 1851? because that was America's 75th anniversary. So I know the comparison isn't exactly the same, but if you had to make a comparison between where America was 9 years before the Civil War, where Israel is 75 years after its establishment. The interesting part about both the United States and Israel, they both broke away from Great Britain. And if you really want to have some fun, take a look at the Israel Declaration of Independence and compare it with the American Declaration of Independence. And you'll find, of course, that the American Declaration has much more mention of God than does the Israel Declaration of Independence. And there's some other interesting comparisons which you could make if you really wanted to sit down and pore over it. So let me very quickly, and I mean quickly, just give me one quick answer on why do you think Zionism succeeded? Sherman? Democracy in the Middle East. Ma'am? He said democracy in the Middle East. Okay, sir? Just the phrase. I'll get back to you. Man behind you. Say it again? The tech sector. Yes, ma'am. The establishment of Israel. Yes. Right. How long have you been married? No, that's okay. You probably control the heated blanket on the bed, but Israeli army. Yes, please. Yes. Right of return. Democracy. Ma'am? Birthright. Good and bad. Yep. Place for the Jewish people. Yes. Thriving economy. Sir.
Jewish self-determination.
Jewish self-determination. Ma'am? Home for the Jewish people.
Something from nothing.
Something from nothing. Good.
I was as a twin. I was going to say.
Yeah, it's pretty good because you're twins, and one would expect the similarity in response. Education, good. So you're thinking about an individual or individuals who made a difference in making the state. I mean, I broadened that out to include every, 300 leaders of Zionism over the last 150 years, but that's probably true. That's fine. So the next part of this is, we'll get to that in the second half of the talk. What part of Zionism do you feel is still yet to be completed? Well, every growth spurt is never finished. And maybe it's because we're observing it is why we're impatient with it. I'll get to the questions in a moment. Just hold on for a second.
Okay.
Right?
Can't answer your question without
U.S. democracy?
No, I said I can't. You asked another question.
Please, go ahead.
How do you define Zionism?
Zionism would best be defined as a Jewish national liberation movement where Jews took destiny into their own hands, decided not to sit on the sidelines and be the object of someone else's sentence, but be the subject of their own. And they decided that they couldn't figure out a uniform way to make it happen, and they therefore went along parallel paths in order to try and find a means that would allow them to have a territory where they could control their own destiny. Zionism is Jews moving from putting their hands up and saying, I'm not going to take it anymore, to I'm going to do something about my status quo and change it. Now, not everyone chose Zionism. Some of the Jews in this 18th and 19th century chose Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Marxism, immigration, a very tiny number. But those who did said, we need a place, and we need to struggle to make that territory. So it's the term national liberation movement is not mine. I didn't invent it. It comes from several pretty famous political scientists at the Hebrew University, including a fellow by the name of Shlomo Avineri, Avineri, if those are interested. He has a couple of great articles, and the other author that I'm quoting here is a fellow by the name of Israel Kollat, Kollatt, and he said Zionism allowed Jews to interfere and change their own future. He said that was the great difference between Zionism and Jewish history over the previous 1,800 years. That's a long answer to a really great question. I'm sorry I didn't answer it immediately, but it is the answer. It is the key question for the evening, of course. Is Zionism a success? And if you can't define what it is, then you don't know if you've reached your expectations. And then you don't know how many different expectations there are and whatever scale that is. So it's a great question. Thank you for shipping it my way. How did Zionism, or the State of Israel, how has it had an impact on world Jewry? Now that in itself is a presentation for 4 or 5 lectures. Where was world Jewry before there was a State of Israel, or before there was Zionism? And what has Zionism done to Jews throughout the world over a period of, let's say, the last 75 years, or we can go back further, let's say, ever since the effervescence of Zionism in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s? Put differently, would you argue, or would you make the case that Zionism made Jews throughout the world stronger? So if you take the view that Zionism in Israel has given Jews throughout the world either a louder voice or multiple voices or disparate voices, the fact is it provided voices. The reason that there is a great deal of discussion about Israel and the court overhaul today in the United States and throughout the world and in Israel is because the nature of the state is under definition, and everyone would like to have their 2 or 3 cents put into it, and they'll come to you and they'll say, so what is that going to mean for this place that I like, or I want to like this place more, I could like this place more if it did X, Y, and Z. So the very fact that Israel is a is an opportunity for discourse or argument, whichever term you want to use. You can use both pretty regularly. I would argue that Israel made Jews stronger throughout the world because it gave them not only an opportunity to stay connected to a place, but to the other half of the Jewish world. Now, you can stay connected to the other half of the Jewish world and be critical. Doesn't mean you have to create a concretization process where you feel you're one, you and they are the same. Ask the tragic question. The worst thing that happened to world Jewry in the last century was 1939 and 1945. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. What if Israel didn't exist tomorrow? What would that do to your lives? Okay, birthright's gone. I'm not saying such a good thing, but all the aspects of Israel as an entity, as a political reality, does what for you personally? It doesn't have to be in the headlines of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNBC, Fox News. It doesn't have to be on the headlines, but the very fact that it exists is in itself an additive to your personal engine. You can decide what that additive is and how much of it you want and how much you don't want, and how do you want to argue with it? Let me ask a different question connected to Zionism in Israel, if I might. A gentleman by the name of Joseph Telushkin, a rabbi, a very famous rabbi, has written numerous books, including one that's called Jewish Literacy. Jewish literacy. Right? I doubt anyone in this room or anyone listening has any problem defining for anyone they're in conversation with what are 3 or 4 or 5 component elements of Jewish literacy. I mean, I got my back to one of them right here, right? For those of you who are online, it's the Torah that's behind me. And you can define Jewish literacy in any number of ways. I mean, just think about defining the term Jewish peoplehood. My gosh. Go around the room, I can go around the room 5 times and you'd never repeat the items that constitute Jewish peoplehood. And a lot of them come from the 5 books of Moses. But if a lot of it has to do with Jewish survival since the 5 books of Moses. Community, taking care of one another, pleading the case to the majority, being sure you could go from Kiddush to Kiddush with not too much Kaddish in between, holidays, I mean, go on and on and on and on. Defining Israel literacy is a little bit different and a lot more difficult. Why is it easier to know something about Judaism than it is to know something about Israel in the sense of its origins, in the sense of its identity? Because this is a place that we frequent, some more than others, sometimes only once or twice a year, as in synagogue. And we have a tradition. And most important of all, for Jewish literacy, we have a memory. We really have a memory when it comes to Jewish literacy, because we remember 8 nights of Hanukkah. We remember Afikomen. We remember the Amidah. We remember what it means not to eat kosher. Notice how I defined it the other way around. That's easy. Knowing the story of Israel and knowing its evolution is a lot more difficult. And one of the reasons I would argue that those of us in the academic or in the teaching world are having increasing more difficult in communicating the story of Israel is that fewer and fewer people are studying it, and therefore fewer and fewer people are teaching it. And if fewer and fewer people are teaching it, it's not like teaching Judaism. Not every, but I would say, 1/3 to 40%, maybe 50% of 13-year-olds in the United States are bar bat mitzvah. Is that fair? 50%? It's about right, right? That's even up to 13, that's a pretty good commitment to understanding what Jewish literacy is about. I mean, you have to learn a little bit about the service and who you are as a people and all the attributes that go along with a service. Even if it's only half of only if it's half of American Jewry. You can't say the same thing about Israel. And while this may be a controversial sentence, I will say it anyway. I think one of the reasons that memory and Israeli history and identity are losing and will continue to lose is because we as a people in the United States are people who commemorate bad things, not necessarily commemorate good things. And part of our historical tradition in this country and Jews throughout the world is think about 39 to 45, and it has taken attention away from American Jewish history, European Jewish history, and Israeli history. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm not saying we do too much of it, but we don't know enough about this place called Israel that emerges out of this concept called Zionism. And as a consequence, we become battered around by blogs and the media and websites in a pretty rapid fashion. Israel has become, for non-Jews, an extraordinarily important locus of identity. And it has to do with people who are serious about their non-Jewish religions, particularly elements of Christianity, where they spend enormous amounts of time learning about the Jewish story and the state of Israel. A year ago, May, probably just about a year ago, I spoke in front of approximately 2,100 evangelical Christians in the Calcoya church outside of Mexico City. I spoke about the history of modern Israel. Now, I didn't do it in Spanish. Don't. I have two people on the front row here who know Spanish fluently, and I don't. And they know what a fraud I would be if I said I did it in Spanish. A half an hour translated, the other half hour was into Spanish. I have never seen 2,100 people so riveted to everything I've said in my life. I wish my children had behaved such. They're pretty good kids, I shouldn't say that. And I never had been in an audience where two people were sitting in the balcony waving an Israeli flag throughout the hour, and I didn't understand why there were two. Because the flag was so big, one person couldn't do it by himself. So that the level of affection that's extended to the state of Israel just doesn't come from Jews or Christians. It comes from people who have it deep inside their fibers. What I'd like to do at this point is pass out a series of maps. And I'm going to ask you if you'd be so kind as not to turn to the other side. I know everyone is going to want to do it, but just stay on the map side for a moment. Joshua, will you help me, please? Thank you. And at this point, while Sherman and Joshua are handing it out, if you have any questions you want to pose toward me as I continue forward, I'd be delighted to try and answer them. Yes. Sure. The anti-Zionism part of anti-Semitism.
Well, yeah, and it's not.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try. I mean, once again, these are really very large questions. So, the point of this, the first side, the picture at the top, and for those of you who can't see this and you're listening, the picture at the left-hand top is a picture of the 1939 Zionist Congress with Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, Eliezer Kaplan, Avram Granovsky sitting in March of 39, and their heads are in their hands, rather expressive in their feeling of what I would call the cosmic oy vey of the moment. You know, for want of a better, oh, look who's here. Hi, how are you? Wow. And then on the right-hand side is the Knesset in September of 1978. So for those of you who may be visualizing it at home, you have on the left-hand side a picture of the Zionist Congress in 1939, and you have the Knesset on the right-hand side. And the Knesset on the right-hand side, if you really want to pick out the people, Simcha Ehrlich is in the first row, Menachem Begin, Ezra Weitzman, Yigal Yadin. Second row, Shimon Peres, Yigal Alon, and Abba Eban. Now, the difference between March 39 and September 78 is 40 years. (40) 39 to 79. Did I do that wrong? I mean, okay, so it's not 40, it's actually 39, just like Jack Benny. But I'm sorry. But the key here, the key of the photographs, the photographs are Jews without self-determination, and on the right-hand side, it's Jews with self-determination. No, it's the 40-year difference when you ask the question before, what is Zionism? This is the absolute essence of Jews taking care of their own future and not taking care of their own future and finding a place in order to do that. That's what those, if you had no other two pictures to use to describe Zionism or Jews without self-determination, those would be the two. The bottom of this handout is what Palestine looked like in 1860s, what Palestine looked like in 1948, and what Israel looked like after 67. I'm not going to go into a historical detail of how the maps evolved, except to say it went from approximately, again, a reasonably short period of time of 100 years where there was no administration in this place, to which there was an extraordinary amount of administration and geographic control over the region. And that has to do with the way the Middle East evolved and the history of the great powers and the origins of the Arab-Palestinian, Arab-Israeli conflict and the demise of the Ottoman Empire and great powers and Cold War. And that in itself is a course of, 15, 18, 20 hours. So let me now go to the second part of the talk and ask you to turn over and go over with me how is Zionism or Israel finished, or how is it well shaped? Now, each one of these in itself is open for at least a six-pack. It reestablished Jewish sovereignty in Eretz Israel. One of the reasons I'm reading this is so people who are listening to this will hear the content. Reestablished Jewish sovereignty in Eretz Israel. Zionism evolved as a Jewish national territory, solidified Israel's existence as the nation state of the Jewish people. Generated a renewed sense of peoplehood, expanded the content of the Arab-Israeli conflict to include not only conflict but also negotiations. That happened in the last 75 years. Recognition received from 6 Arab neighbors. Israel changed its politics more than once, moving from one political party that was dominant for 29 years to multiple political parties that are dominant today, without any real sense of what the kaleidoscope in the parties looks like tomorrow. It's just sitting there, and you, like I would turn the microphone, you would turn the kaleidoscope and you would see the different parties taking different shapes, some of them disappearing, some of them re-entering the political process, some of them creating a confederation with the ones next door, some of them dominating and someone being dominated. Now, why is that? Because when Jews ran their own kehillah or their own millet in the Ottoman Empire, when they ran their own communities, more often than not, the tent was bigger rather than smaller. You couldn't be outside the tent and be protected. So the tendency was to take care of everyone, but also give voice to pluralism, even if it was very narrowly defined. certainly Israel's very existence has changed the manner in which Jews interact with one another and in which they interact with this place. That did not exist in 1940. It didn't exist in 1930. It certainly exists today. And this is all in 75 years. This is not a very long period of historical time. A founding concept in Jewish existence in the diaspora, because Jews were a minority wherever they lived, they had to create and sustain and maintain relationships with the majority. The czar, the duke, the prince, the king, the president, whomever it was, the nasty autocrat. Even though there is a Jewish state that has a majority, the state still has to have positive relations with a major power in order to assure of its tomorrow. Jews were lobbyists in the ghetto. Lobbying is not something that's new. Speaking on behalf of your community is not new. Israel absorbed with difficulty waves of Jewish immigration, and I'm not certain that the original thinkers of Zionism in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they understood that reestablishing a Jewish presence in Eretz Israel was important, but I'm not sure they understood the consequences of absorbing a large number of people into one place over a short period of time and how difficult that might be. I think it was a totally unforeseen circumstance or anticipated outcome. And yet they continue to do it. I mean, when you think about 800,000 Jews from Middle Eastern lands coming into the area of Eretz Israel or the area of Palestine between 1945 and 1953, doubling the population that was there. And it wasn't done easily, and the Jews who came from Arab lands, they weren't particularly thrilled by the manner in which the resident Jewish population was managing their lives. I think I've been very, very polite in my definition. But there have been Russian Jews. 1 million Russian Jews came in the 80s and 90s. Ethiopians, Yemenis in the 1880s, 1890s. I don't think anyone had any notion in the 1880s and the 1890s what the reconstitution of Hebrew would do for a cultural renaissance of a language that had only heretofore been used primarily in the synagogue. It was explosive. And the fact that it was explosive is remarkable. When you think about literature, art, music, cooking, all of the things that you label as culture, it's been explosive. It's an explosive growth. Israeli culture is explosive in its growth, as has been the Israeli economy, if you had to make a comparison. Israel has magnetized world Jewry to utilize and be proud of Israeli existence as a place in parallel or as an alternative to Jewish religious practice. Has Israel become a religion for Jews? And if it has become a religion for Jews, what happens when the vibrancy of that entity, Israel, begins to get eroded on the edges by criticism, by attacks, both verbal and physical. In other words, if there's been even a mediocre transference of one's Jewishness to feeling an identity to Israel, when Israel is eroded at the edges, what does that do to the individual's feeling about their Jewish identity? It's corrosive. Because what's happening is you've given up shul on Saturday morning. I'm being very hard here. You've given up shul on Saturday morning, and instead you've decided you'll go twice a year, and instead on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock you'll tee off. Or you'll go play 2 sets of tennis. And you won't be like your father, your grandfather, your grandmother, your aunts, your uncles, who 3 or 4 generations ago made this place the focal point of your Jewish identity. Now, that's all part of assimilation. I get it. I understand all that. But it's not just the assimilation that's taking place, it's the volunteer nature in which Jews in America decided that Israel was going to be their injection point and their inflection point for their identity. There's a good and there's a not so good with that, but that's the reality of what the change is taking place. Engage world Jewry and non-Jews to support, sustain, and promote the Jewish state, no doubt about it. Zionism continues to preserve Jewish self-determination, maintain the state majority, protect its security, ensure its economic strength, preserve strong bonds with diaspora Jewry. I know it's not a continuous line. I know it's not a flat line that is always headed in a trajectory of 35 to 40 degrees, and it's always increasing. I know it's a sine curve, and I know it goes up and down. Created an environment ripe for development and innovation, and established itself as a world leader in technology, medicine, social innovation, and in many other fields. Once again, the Zionist mothers and fathers of 100 years ago, let alone 75 years ago, didn't have this one in mind. Now you have to ask yourself the question, where did this innovative talent, where did this notion of adapting and innovating come from? Was that part of something that was imported from the Jewish diaspora? Was that part of surviving as a minority in the majority world? And if you're shaking your head yes, and you're going to have to answer the question, how? How did it go from generation to generation? How do you pass that on? How do you pass the inquisitiveness on? Is it family? Is it role models? How does that all operate? It's not necessarily something that you read in the Torah or in Talmud. It's part of the historic practice. Evolved a political system based on ideology and personal characteristics. The Israeli political system is based upon ideological affinity to a thought and is dominated by personalities. It's so different from American politics, because American politics has one other aspect. It has a lot of personality and it has a lot of ideology, but the other aspect of American politics is we tend to be representative of particular places, whether it's Congress, the Senate, judiciary, whatever it is. We tend to have layers of representation. In Israel, everyone is in that 120-member Knesset, and that's a whole different discussion, again, about how many institutions should there be in the state of Israel that have equal power or have the ability to check each other as they go through decision making that relates to day-to-day life. So on the bottom half of my list is what are the unfinished results of Zionism so far that Israel has not completed or that remain open. Jews have not been gathered into the land of Israel. The ingathering has not been completed. Only half the Jews in the world live in the state of Israel. This notion of Jews would all return to the state of Israel or would return to the place hasn't materialized. And much like the United States in 1851, Israel has not defined its borders. America hadn't defined its borders in 1851. Israel has not defined its borders. Now, is defining your borders absolutely necessary to survive as a state? No, obviously not. But when you keep the question open, then the question you always have to ask yourself, if you draw it here, what's on the other side? Yes, you had a question, sir. Yes, sir.
Was it always intended by?
I think it was a
50% now.
right.
The majority of Jews.
Right. I think it was a dream. I think it was let's get as many Jews to accept Zionism as at all possible. The reason Zionism couldn't attract more Jews is because there was an alternative opportunity for Jews when their lives went south economically and politically with the rise of Aryan anti-Semitism in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s and failed emancipation. The alternative was that Jews intellectually and physically decided they weren't going to try or think about Zionism. They were going to go to a place that was more physically secure, not a place that was more ideological in tune with what the Zionists thought that came along 50, 60, or 70 years later. I mean, Zionism came along late in that sense. So Zionism in America. The argument was always the place wasn't big enough. Well, it keeps on taking more and more and more and more. Right? I don't know whether it's, I don't know. I've never heard someone say, I wanted to go live in Israel, but I couldn't find a space. Maybe you couldn't find an apartment, but you could also find a space, or at least a reasonable apartment. But I get your point. It's well taken. Israel has not been able to finalize relations with its immediate Arab Muslim neighbors. Not completely. It hasn't decided on what its relationship is with the Palestinians living in those territories of the West Bank and Gaza, or Judea and Samaria. And it hasn't reached a compromise yet about what the role of civil judiciary should be vis-a-vis the role of the rabbinic judiciary. There's an uneven status quo which continues, and there's a lot of tension within it. The item I have here, to end or retard anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism. I don't know, it's hard to judge whether when the State of Israel was created in 1948, whether there would really be a belief, or belief really existed, that anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism would end. I don't know there was a great discussion about it, but it doesn't seem to have evolved. And those who dislike the creation of the state in 48. Whether it be Arabs or non-Arabs, whether it be members of the U.S. State Department who were absolutely livid against Truman recognizing the State of Israel, or whether it was Nasser before the Six-Day War, who absolutely wanted to see Israel disappear. The delegitimization of a Jewish state has been part of anti-Jewish feeling or anti-Israeli feeling from the very foundations of the state. That has not gone away simply because 6 Arab states have recognized the State of Israel. 6 Arab leaders do not get up every morning, no matter how warm they may feel toward the state in terms of pragmatic necessity and strategic common national interest, they don't wake up every morning and say, I wish I were Theodore Herzl. And I think there's a myth amongst world Jewry that believes that somehow the Middle Eastern Arab states who made an agreement with Israel are really thrilled by it. I think all of those states, see if I say this right, all of these states needed to make an accommodation with the Jewish state, not necessarily because they wanted to. There's a difference between need and want. And 75 years after Israel's creation, it still is in a very difficult neighborhood. Really very, very difficult. And I'm not just talking about Iran. I mean, it's in a difficult neighborhood. I guess if Israel were located in Coral Gables or someplace between, Portland and San Diego, it would be a little different. I don't think Israel and Israelis or American Jews who support the State of Israel have spent a remote amount of time, and here I'm singling out American Jews, haven't spent a remote amount of time realizing how different Israeli Jews are from American Jews, and vice versa. How different they are in terms of day-to-day lives, in the sense of community. What's it like living as a majority as compared to living as a minority? I mean, we have to do a better job, I believe, as American Jews in understanding Israelis, as they have to do a better job of understanding us and who we are and how we're maybe the same. We certainly are the same tribe, but I think we make up a different minion. I don't know how else to put it. Now, I've rambled on for a good period of time. I'm glad. I don't know if I answered your question about why anti-Zionism is a part of anti-Semitism, but I think one of the reasons it sits there, very apparent, is for Jews to constitute power and authority and influence. For some folks, whether it's ideological or philosophical or physical, it is contrary to their belief that Jews should have the ability to have their own territory and make their own decisions. And consequently, as a person, as an individual who may be opposed to that, I have to negate the very reality of the state. The very reality that Jews are constituting a nucleus for determining their own future. Besides which, I may not like the decisions they make. I may find their decisions, wholly unacceptable, totally unacceptable. And once you put yourself into the 21st century media world, of blogs of people getting away and saying anything they want to about anything whenever they want to. There's no check. No one is holding someone by the back of their neck saying, you can't say that, you can't do that. I mean, look at politicians in America the last 30 years. The nonsense that comes out of their mouths. Nonsense. And there are people who actually follow these kinds of articulate politicians. And you can't do anything about it. You can't get a hose from the fire truck and put it out with water. You can't. It's impossible. It's impossible to eradicate anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. Because if there are people who feel so invested in it, they're not going to give it up. That's likely. It doesn't matter. You don't have to know about anything to speak out on anything. You just have to have a mouth and a microphone. Oops. I think Israel remains somewhat unfinished in the last two to feel secure because of its in its borders, on its borders. It's been tough for 75 years. But the citizens in the state of Israel seem committed to this place. They haven't left in mass droves. They've stayed committed to this idea of being an Israeli, of living in this place. So, it has, if I can use a different phrase, it has stickiness. Sure. Can you use this for me, please?
Need it by Saturday. The shift from we as American Jews support you, Israel. Now it almost feels like actually from Israel, you as American Jews need us. How did that shift happen, and how do you see that in the next 5 to 10 years? It like when my parents grew up, it was, Israel bonds and, it's 1967, 1973, like without us, we can't exist. And now it feels like the opposite way, as actually without us, meaning Israel, you as American Jews can't exist.
What you're asking is that the shift in North American Jewry over the, let's say, 50 years. Let's say since June 67. All right? I'm just arbitrarily picked it. June 67 was an enormous benchmark in Israeli history and American Jewish history because it secured the state of Israel 20 years after its creation and 25 years after the Holocaust. It made American Jews extraordinarily prideful of the state of Israel that thought it was going to have to bury its population in downtown Tel Aviv, 4 days before the war of June 67. It exploded American Jewry's realization that they could make a difference. And that, in American minds of American Jews, that meant they ended up participating, joining, and undergirding the Soviet Jewry movement. In other words, the impact of the Six-Day War was dramatic on American Jews, not only in terms of providing funds and people going and missions, and Israel now changed in the minds of American Jews. It wasn't just a sleepy place that was trying to defend itself. It became extraordinarily relevant. I think it's where the transfer began to move from Israel became a central part of American Jewish identity. I'm talking about the general public. I'm not talking about 80% or 85%. What happens over those 50 years is a steady erosion and decline in a willingness to accept the change in Israel that took place once Israel had a peace treaty with Egypt. From 77 forward, with Begin's election, and the Labor Party is turned out, American Jews became somewhat skittish with a political party it knew very little about. And then there came the whole issue of what to do about those territories that were taken in 67. And how would they be used? Didn't become an issue until the late 1980s. But it evolved from the 67 war forward. And at the end of the 80s, it became a major issue in Israel, and American Jews latched onto it. And then there was this identity to Israel that now had a shape and a content that said, we know better than what you should be doing with the territories. It's now our chance to tell you how to behave and when you should do A, B, C, D, E. And that's how organizations evolved in the 90s and the 2000s, and the drift began to filter in. And now you didn't have this dramatic demographic shift in 67, but you had a slow demographic shift 20 years later and a perceptible demographic shift 40 years later. Still, 65, 70% of American Jews still say Israel's important a part of their lives, but they don't have it with the fierceness and the ferocity and the binding nature that existed 50 years ago or 60 years ago. There's another reality that has nothing to do with Israel or its policies. The other reality is, it's called assimilation. American Jews are becoming highly assimilated into American society. What is it, 55% of Jews who marry today are intermarried? Is that about right? 55%? I don't know if that's what? It's lower now. They just did a new survey. 45%. And where was it in 1950? Whatever the percentage is, assimilation has an impact on erosion of identity. Or if not an erosion, it has a reconstitution of identity and a rebuilding of it in a different way. Yes, please. Yes.
I don't like. From the Jewish world, and I think it's like a total part.
I think the nature of Judaism or Jewishness is what is changing and constantly changing.
And there's an incredible series.
Yes, that's right.
There's like Herzl Zionism, and then there's
Sure, sure.
so like is it
Hmm.
versus what is completed? Because
Yeah, I think you could use the word, you could use the Zionism's plural. I wouldn't use the term Americans plural. I would say we're Americans. I would. That's a very personal thing. We're Americans, and I believe in the system of government, and I believe in freedom and liberty and the Constitution. I have, fundamental beliefs about. I don't have a. I don't. My kids don't have a different definition of America than I do. Now they may not like the same politicians and the same decisions that are made. I would argue the same thing about Zionism. Zionism has as its fundamental root the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people.
but that has already
Now what you're saying exactly. Now what you're saying is how is it being defined? And I'm saying Israel is 1851. We are in the we are looking at Israel 75 years, and it hasn't yet even come close to the 250 plus years of America in its evolution. But we're sitting there watching it and looking at it with a microscope or with a fine, we're examining it on a day-to-day basis, and therefore we're making these incredibly fine distinctions of I'm a Zionist if I'm this, or I'm a post-Zionist, or I'm a post-Zionist. Perfectly legitimate. I don't think it ends, I don't think it changes the rudimentary reality that Zionism is the nation state of the Jewish people. I don't think that changes. Now, you may say to me, it's got to change because it can't be the nation state of the Jewish people. It's got to be a multinational state where all religions and all nationalities are dutifully held in equality. Legitimate. But that doesn't change the origins of Zionism or the fact that it exists because of what occurred on May 14th, 1948. Now, I'm sitting here either pleading with you or arguing with you or begging with you. Please accept me as a historian. I'm an ideologue. I'm an idol worshiper of history. I don't think you can change yesterday, no matter how you may want to, and I don't mean you personally, right? What happened between 45 and 49 happened between 45 and 49 because people made decisions. Whether we like the decisions or not today is an entirely different issue. It doesn't change the reality that the state of Israel is 75 years old because some people made an effort to make it happen from the 1840s to the late 1940s. That's the point of my evening. Yes, sir. Oh, gee. He wants an update on the campuses before Shachrit. The forces, wow. This sounds, almost like the forces. The classroom has changed in 50 years. The classroom is not a place anymore where students will come, and this is a big generality. I retired 2 years ago from Emory, and they can't do too much to me, and I probably would have said it anyway 15 or 20 years ago anyway. The classroom has become a place, and I mean this also for middle schools and high schools, many of them in the country, where people come to learn, but the people who do the teaching are more interested in making kids happy or satisfied, or their boards or their PTAs or their administrators more sanguine, rather than insisting on what the criteria for learning are. A national Jewish education organization came out with a study yesterday. The 35-page study, 30-page study. It was a study that looked at how Jewish children in the United States are educated in day schools, congregational schools, camps. In the entire report, the word Israel is used once, and the word Zionism is used twice. I'm sorry, the word Zionism was used once, and the word Israel was used twice. Dealing with Jewish education in North America. You want to get back to a definition of what is Israel literacy? I would maintain that people who are teaching in many places teach Israel because it's part of what happens in April and May called the Yoms. We got 4 or 5 of them. Ask your rabbi about some of the individuals that he has come to learn and understand and respect who are participating in a learning process with him about the knowledge base that some of them may have when they go off into a synagogue. To talk about this place that houses half the Jewish world. Israel literacy is not well. In fact, I don't think it's yet on its deathbed, but I think it's got some real serious problems. And I think more people are interested in teaching how you teach than what you teach. And I would say the same thing about the campus classroom. Politics has become a central part of the hiring process in academia and how courses are taught, how syllabi are chosen, how books and articles are chosen for those syllabi, what the requirements are. I'm sure there are great exceptions in North American institutions, but over the last 50 years, there has been a deterioration in, I would argue, in the standards of what faculty are asking of their students. Not that you have to write 3 or 5 papers or you have to give an oral presentation. I'm talking about what is the content? Would you disagree? It's really difficult to stand here and for me to speak on behalf of U.S. campuses. I mean, it's one person's opinion, and you have to take it at that. All right? Okay, 44 years of teaching is okay. It's a good, you can look back on it and say, this is what I learned, but I'm not the only guy on the block. What else we got? Yes, sir.
Would you say
I would disagree too. I mean, I'm talking about Israel at 75 because we're celebrating 75 years from 48.
but we talk a lot about Zionism, and I just kind of want to
Zionism in Jerusalem, the word Zionism in Jerusalem are in Jewish daily prayer. Now, I don't know whether that starts in the 15th century or the 12th century, but
before that.
we're going back. The point about Jewish communal existence, it has been surrounded by the 5 books of Moses for its entire existence. I'll call Sinai the beginning. And how we took this book with us, and when we traveled, we took it with us. And when we took it with us, every year we read the book and then we turned it over and we read it again. And every year we read it again and again and again and again. That's part of Zionism. That's part of who we are. Whether we go to shul on Shabbos or not, that's who we are. So I would certainly, as the devotee, the idol worshiper of history, I would say it goes much further back than 48. It goes much further back than the 1850s. Because if you want to see how Jews behaved with one another, you have to go look at the previous 1,000 years, because that's part of the DNA that they schlepped with them as immigrants when they come in the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth Aliyah that made the state. I'm absolutely convinced of it. And there are very few things I'm convinced of. But that trajectory, and I wish more people understood the trajectory and didn't believe that Israeli history began in 1967 or 48. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here. Pleasure.
We want to thank Dr. Ken Stein for joining us, both here and also virtually. We're thankfully going to send this amazing lecture around as we begin to celebrate 75 years of the State of Israel. Over the upcoming week, there's lots of different events. Next Shabbat, Friday night and Saturday, Shani Zamir will have a beautiful Shabbat musical experience, and then David Matlow, who's one of the world experts on Herzl, will be here with an artifact collection of Herzl. And our Mirage Art Gallery will have an exhibit by the artist Dudu Harel of Zionism and Jerusalem as well. Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.